So we're here to talk about decentralized narratives. And what I thought we could start with is just a discussion around narrative itself and how, what we all think narrative is as a panel, and either where does it come from? Yeah, let's start there. Venkat, what do you think about narratives?
Leaving aside the decentralized stuff, what is a narrative? I kind of think of it as step-by-step improvisation of stuff as it's happening. And an early complaint I got about a lot of my writing was I was good at beginning things but not ending things. So I'm very glad to see narrative culture shifting to, it's okay to start stories that you don't finish. So that's how I think of narratives.
I think that's quite interesting because when we use narrative in everyday life, we usually mean story, or people say narrative, what's the narrative on this thing? And Kara, what do you think about maybe the conflation between story and narrative that happens?
Sure. Yeah, I think narrative is one of those words that kind of suffers from being used differently in a lot of different contexts. And so sometimes people are using it to mean an atomic level of a belief or something that's shared among a group of people. I share the same definition as you of it's a kind of a step-by-step account of experiences. But in a story context, it's more conflated with the idea of a plot, which I think is often not what we mean, especially in decentralized narrative or in autonomous worlds.
I'll have to come to my myth-making mechanisms talk tomorrow, and we'll discuss this further. However, I think that GVN, what do you think about narrative? Let's go with that.
No, I think I agree with both these points. I think I really like the step-by-step. I think I still have to find a good definition of narrative, but my entry point is from writer Katie Acker that points out narrative as simply as the linearity of language that it's brought together by these fragments. And I think I'm interested in when you put this fragment together, the meaning that emerge, but also the power relations that emerge. And I think I like this step-by-step definition because I think it points towards I think what autonomous world will be good at, that it's producing this ever-evolving narrative rather than these closed systems with specific relation between all the parts that are composed.
Did you want to say something, Venkat? No. So if we're talking about narrative as something that is emerging step by step, when we talked about this before, we spoke a lot about Marvel films, and how Marvel is literally the MCU, right? It's the Marvel universe, and would it be fair to say? I mean, anyone can jump in on this, but would it be fair to say that each film is a beginning, middle, and end of something that is occurring within the wider universe of the story, and which means that I don't know if anyone's seen that Martin Scorsese quote about Marvel movies being more like theme park rides than actual films. I think that's an interesting thing because what they're doing is it's they're building these moments, moment to moment, and then you immediately move on to the next film. It's not like don't know, it's the new world of franchising, I guess. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that.
Sure, I can jump in on that. I think a lot of Marvel storytelling is kind of based around characters, and there was an era that was going on in franchise films for the past 10 or 15 years that was very character-driven and kind of archetype and genre-heavy. Mm-hmm. And so with Marvel, it is over and over again telling the superhero story and kind of creating these characters that it's easy to have a general understanding of what's going to happen. And I think that the franchise is kind of suffering from that now, where it is a narrative that became familiar to people, and each one did have a beginning, middle, and end, and often predictably, while leaving it open-ended to continue a franchise. And so something that raises for me is how do you tell a story that does not necessarily end or that has a lot of different eras without it getting stale or boring?
A lot of people have spoken about emergent narrative, one of the things that I guess is a problem about like emergent narrative is this decentralization, because it depends on who is experiencing what events that that leads to the example I think earlier someone was talking about, you can have two interpretations of the same event that has occurred, a battle, and who gets to say what is true about an emergent narrative, I think is a very important question when it comes to like cohering all of these decentralized narratives. As an example, did you mention that in your talk this morning, Venkat? Like, who gets to say what is true about a world or the events that took place in a world?
No, I think I might have like obliquely driven past that point, but I didn't talk about it. But I think it's a very important question, and I think it's actually one of the things that distinguishes decentralized and centralized narratives. Like, I forget where I read this, but it's a book about classical storytelling in like a format called, it's like stand-up comedy, but it's storytelling that has that format. And this guy who's really good at it made up this rule that you're not allowed to tell any story except one that happened to you. And then, you get good at telling that story. And he has a whole book about storytelling. And one of the sort of like analysis he does was about the Jurassic Park franchise. And he says something like every Jurassic Park movie is about like an adult who hates kids learning to love kids. And this is kind of true of the first Jurassic Park movie, Sam Neill, and the latest one. Again, yes, it's true, but I found myself immediately saying, yes, I know you're an award-winning, prize-winning storyteller who's really good at this stuff, but I disagree. I think the Jurassic Park movies are about dinosaurs. That's why I go to see the movies. And yes, maybe these very clever old school traditional storytellers have like a point about like narrative structure, but I think decentralized narrative allows us to challenge that sort of thing. So if we wanted to write a decentralized version of Jurassic Park, I think one very fun thing to do would be to allow everybody to make their own dinosaurs, right? So I don't know if that's an answer, but yes, I think challenging the idea that there's an authoritative way to tell stories is actually a very important function of decentralized narrative.
Kara, we were talking about authorship earlier, because one assumes that if you have a decentralized narrative, then there should have been, or there is, an author. And in traditional stories, obviously the author is the person that generates the world of the book. And again, coming back to this like conversation about what is and isn't true in a world, if you have a franchise or a game, you're going to have a fandom, and that fandom might not like the things that you, as an author of the world, has chosen to do with the world. And yeah, I wonder if we should talk about like Harry Potter or any of those kind of fandoms.
Sure, yeah. I feel like I'm going to have to say these things about all of these very famous franchises, and I hope I'm not offending anyone who's a fan in the audience of any of them. But I think that like in narratives in general and in decentralized narratives, like there's it happens on the level of a group of people, like the people who are experiencing and creating the narrative together. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be in the container of a technical substrate or of like a medium. And it really comes down to like what a group of people believes in terms of what's called canon. And so in the case of something like a book or a famous franchise, a lot of people will define the canon as anything that the author says that is published. That's important for Harry Potter, since J.K. Rowling is known for retconning a lot of things. And so like there's kind of a shared agreement among the group of people about what counts as canon and what type of interaction they're having with that content. So that is like the traditional pattern that people follow with centralized narratives or with books or franchises, things like that. And what the autonomous or decentralized or networked version raises the possibility of is people interacting in new ways and having to negotiate the boundaries of like what the entry condition is for canon in the world, which I think is pretty interesting.
How do fandoms who are often there, I want to mention the Omegaverse, but which is a very strange area of fan fiction. But I'm wondering, do you know how fandoms negotiate? Because it will be a negotiation. It's not necessarily like a dictatorial, fiat decision that this is true and this isn't, or this is canon. Do you know how fandoms tend to? Is it just they produce more material with one fact being true about the world?
I feel like they negotiate violently. I guess like from what I've seen of looking at fandoms and how they're like collaborating with each other or trying to like land grab definitions or genres, it seems to be like creating more content in a certain way or exporting that content to other groups and claiming a definition. So for instance, like in fan fiction, there are certain genres that come out of fan fiction simply because a lot of authors write similar patterns and they're inspired by each other. They're in a similar like beta reader community. And so they're creating this content that ends up forming into a genre emergently over time. And as they do that, some people will then try to, there's a practice known as filing off the serial numbers of a fan fiction and submitting it as its own published work. And so that is like a way that people kind of negotiate or name a genre that kind of like ports it into a more traditional form. And that usually results in a lot of backlash from a fandom. And so it's like a negotiation of whether something is owned by the community or if it is something that can be like a new creative invention by an individual.
So the filing off the serial numbers is almost an escapes narrative from the world. Yeah.
Can I add something real quick? Sure. This year I came across a not so famous franchise, maybe it's not mentioned, but the Roald Dahl. I don't know if you heard the children book writer. That this year a lot of his books were re-edited because he wrote like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda, and a lot of characters were like just super politically incorrect right now. So the editor started rewriting books. And there was like this big discussion. I was like, well, you can't like just rename or like change characters from some of the fans. But I think it's also pointed how it became a necessity. Like if you want to like, well, that's kind of problematic. But like also like, like the publisher themselves, if they want to keep this world alive and meaningful for new generations, they have to kind of like open it surgically, remove some stuff or change, and then reclose it. And I think it's quite an interesting fact because it seems like there is this need to open the boundaries of the world, but then sometimes there is also like not the understanding of like, who gets to do that, and also like, can we just leave them open at some point, yeah.
I mean, one of the big issues is copyright as well with this, and I think it's interesting that there's kind of like there's two maybe tensions that are happening in, I think it's probably wider culture and not just specifically with narratives, but we live under this condition where it's like 70 years plus the life of the author, well, in the United States, which means that if you create a new story or you create a new context for stories to take place in, then we already have we're not allowed to use it for 100 years. But at the same time, we live in this condition where we're here talking about autonomous worlds, and there's games being built on loot, for example, which was, the way it was constructed as an initial prompt almost, here is bags of loot, go do it. And the thing that was important for me about loot as a franchise, as an idea, is that it relies on all of the tropes of sword and sorcery that everyone is immediately familiar with, which is in itself, sword and sorcery is basically like its own open genre, which is like evolved from the Arthurian romances, basically, and I think it's on this point, it's instructive that original MUDs in the 1980s were set in the world of Camelot or Avalon and so on and so forth, because it was an IP that wasn't owned by anyone and everybody else could use. So since War of the Worlds recently fell into the public domain, perhaps someone should be building a War of the Worlds game. But I was wondering your views on this about, like, given that this real demand or understanding of ownership of a story, or at least the characters within a story, and then there's this tension for people wanting to play in the world. I guess one of the things that designers of autonomous worlds need to think about is how to do that negotiation between like the fandom and then it feels like a wider tension in culture in general. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think this is actually an interesting point at which to segue from like traditional literary fiction of stories and things like that. Like even stories in like the pre-modern times, like, take something like the Mahabharata, it's notionally attributed to one mythical author, but it's fundamentally an accretion of like fan fiction without like a central canon, but it accretes. So copyright is partly an artifact of the industrial age, partly also an artifact of scale. So it's interesting that even the biggest single author books today are nothing compared to like the large epics of like 2000 years ago, huge things. And I think the equivalent today is stuff like video games. Like when things get large enough, it's actually practically infeasible to hold on to like strong notions of copyright, because you can't actually tell scalable narratives if you are like a little too tight-fisted about that stuff, right? So loot is a good sort of example. A more traditional gaming example that just occurred to me is Steve Yagi had this wonderful article called The Borderlands Gun Collectors Club, which, for those of you who don't know, I didn't know about this, I'm not a gamer, but it talks about like big games that age into a stage that is apparently known as elder games. And in the case of Borderlands, everybody, after the game had aged and everybody had done their first playthrough, second playthrough, speed running, all those like basic ways of playing a game, they all turned into gun collectors. So they all went around collecting guns and displaying them in their cabinets. And that's kind of like, it fits into like my step-by-step notion of like the step-by-step version of playing a decentralized narrative is like object-by-object collecting. And that's kind of why it fits so well with like, blockchains and tokens and NFT type things. It's a way to like build in so much complexity that the dynamic of content generation is forced to escape like rigid notions of copyright and ownership. You kind of have to get out of that to keep the game going at all.
We were also talking before about Dark Souls and like how like the Dark Souls and like generally like From Software games are like so hard that you cannot play but just be immersed in the world, but you have to like tab out, go on some forum and like find the solution, or like, find what other people. So it becomes this like collective play, and also their narrative, it's like almost kind of unfinished, just to like allow fans to just like fill those gaps. I think that's so it's, I think like interesting, how many games are just played in different.
I would also build on that. Also a fan of Dark Souls, but I really love the quote that games are tools for making metagames. And I think that like metagames by nature spill over out of the container of whatever the original medium and context is. And so as you think about like what counts as like a game or a narrative or a story world, part of that becomes like the external paratextual media that people are like inspired to produce by a certain game. So like the fan wikis, the drama that happens in the editing of the fan wikis, the YouTubers who become like famous personas and can kind of like guide and dictate people's experience of a game are their own layer of narrative that gets built on top of it.
That, and to build on that again, I think like also like I'm really interested, for example, in like MOBAs like Dota or like League of Legends, how there's this complete loss of narrative in the gameplay, and that's what makes just produce fan fiction. And then how like 1 or 2 years ago when the series, like this Netflix series came out, it just like the like Riot Games just kind of like capitalized on all this fan fiction. I think it also brings forward another problem for me, is that if we don't open up this world, there's just gonna be always this like most of the time the owner of the copyright that can like milk milk the fans. But yeah, it's very interesting to like this like complete loss of narrative in the game, so that the narrative can evolve in other media or outside that world. Yeah,
they do, in their defense. You do have things like tanks, right, which like as an element in the system of the game has narrative attached to it in order to explain the context in which it's.
I think actually that's a very interesting view, and I think that there's I think maybe it's like again, it's a long shot, but it kind of like how loot works. It's just like the tank is like a narrative prompt that you can build on, and it comes with like a package that you recognize, you're familiar with, and that allows you to like answer questions like, okay, if this is a tank and it should get a lot of damage, like kind of like be a sponge, how does it look like? And I think, so it's when a mechanic turns into like a narrative prompt, I think it's a very interesting point you made. Yeah.
I'm thinking now that we could maybe make the distinction between like authorial narratives, even if which are top down, obviously, but then if we're talking about decentralized narratives as coming up, and what's happening is, from an authorial point of view, you have like the original text, and then the fans blow the story open with producing their own media and fan art. But in a decentralized narrative, what's actually happening is that it's all unfolding and coming up from the producers. But then the key part is sense making, and that's to your point about the YouTubers, like who's making sense of the narrative, and what happens when the same event, back to the same event thing. Like, I think we should probably, maybe if you could offer your views on this, but like what happens when you have two competing views of the same thing, like, I know you said about like people battle it out in the comments on Tumblr usually, but I think this is something that I'm really interested in, actually, is your views on how we resolve these sense making.
Totally. I guess I try to think about it. There's like a lot of ways that people resolve this sense-making thing, depending on like what genre they're into and what their community is. I think ultimately, like if groups of people disagree about their view of a single event, they have to kind of like manage the overall context of the community on a social level. So like an example of this would be like speedrunning rule sets. And so those, like, people will agree on a certain way to speedrun a game, and like that is how they're measuring like who's the fastest in that certain rule set. If people want to play with a different rule set and there are enough people interested in that category, then it can kind of become its own separate thing. And I think that same thing kind of happens with narrative negotiation as well, where if there are some people who are fans of something who like to experience it in one way or believe about something about it in one way, they'll negotiate a shared social rule set that has its own stickiness as a community. It might differ from a different community of that's a fan of that same piece of original media. And ultimately, like, as long as it's internally consistent with their social group, then it's no longer a conflict. It can still be a conflict of like group versus group online at different points, but like I think people negotiate with like the group of people whose views they care about for that. Within a fandom.
Yeah, what you were saying made me think about like when we start thinking about decentralized narratives primarily from an authorship perspective, you get caught up in this mode of like analyzing, all right, what were traditional authors, what are these new fans doing, and things like that. And something Josh Stark was saying this morning in his talk, I think might be relevant as a lens here, which is, what is the source of hardness that people are organizing around? And in traditional narrative, I think it's content tropes. So, like the idea that the hero must save the cat. This is, by the way, a trope in Hollywood storytelling. It's like, to establish that the character is a hero, the hero has to save a cat in the first 5 minutes or something like that for first 5 beats. And you've got TV tropes, which is an entire encyclopedia of like hard elements. That's the source of hardness. And when you challenge narrative paradigms, so the hero's journey, if you challenge it, you have to challenge its notions of hardness. And this has been very unsuccessful in general. Like Ursula Le Guin, she's like a really powerful writer, and she came up with this theory called the carrier bag theory of fiction. But her own works, if you read them, they're not really carrier bag stories. And I think that's because she got halfway there, but she didn't identify what's like the source of hardness in carrier bag narratives as opposed to hero's journey. And the kind of stuff you're talking about where fans are part of co-creation, what you just said, like, speed running and so forth, it makes me think that the hard elements are participation tropes. So speed running is a hard way of like being a participant in a game. Like, what's it called? The Bartle test, the 4, those seem like 4 hard points of participation. So I don't know, is this, like, do you guys have thoughts on like, what's the source of hardness in decentralized narratives?
I think that the source of hardness comes from myth-making mechanisms, actually, in that what you actually require is mechanisms to take the views, to translate the narrative or the social agreement that's taken place, and then systematize it into the system itself. And that is what we're all here going to be struggling to work on over the next year, I would have thought, as the games that we're working on get more and more complicated. How do we systematize narrative?
I mean, I think the Dark Forest game, it's a good example of how they managed to kind of like in the like diegetic world embed that process. So it's like if you have 2 different views of what should happen next in this world, you fight in the game. I mean, like EVE Online, I think it also has a lot of these stories where they found a way of just embedding all these meta narratives in the game itself, so you don't necessarily always need another channel to fulfill that gap, or to fill that gap, thanks to like read and write, or like thanks to their APIs, I think. So yeah.
As you were speaking, it just occurred to me that we haven't talked about wrestling at all. And there's a really great article in the New York Times recently called "Is Everything Wrestling Now?" I really highly recommend you check that out. But basically, the way that they're talking about is how that you have this highly choreographed theatrical element of it, but then also certain narratives are actually resolved between actors within the world of wrestling in the ring. And you never know, and that's the whole point. You never know which was a scripted thing and which isn't, which is, kayfabe and so on and so forth. Like that's the, and I wonder if maybe we should be looking towards wrestling for some of the answers around decentralized narratives, because even fan stories immediately make their way into make their way into the world of wrestling.
I think, that is a good article. I remember that being a very fun one. I think that kind of plays into some of what you're talking about with like tropes of participation. Wrestling is something that is semi medium agnostic. Like people are participating in a lot of different formats and contexts. And I think some of the hardness of like participating or experiencing a narrative does come from like the different ways that people are like as groups, like the different tropes of participation that exist. And those can kind of like coalesce into tropes of mediums as well. So like people over and over again acting out the same types of dramas, or news articles that get written in a specific way or voice about wrestling, things like that. So I guess I would be interested in thinking about like, in general, medium agnostic types of storytelling that have to take place by nature in a lot of different formats, and that can kind of be driven more by like the participation and how people want to experience them than by planning a specific type of media.
Sports journalism.
That's kind of like a perfect cue for the thought that was running through my mind. Like, KFAB it's interesting that the performance is so ritualized that the audience knows it, the performers know it, they know what's going to happen. They know down to the moves, right, in the wrestling ring. They know what kinds of moves. If you're literate in wrestling, which I'm not, apparently you can kind of like read the unfolding action. Yet they manage to retain interest because, like you said, there is an element that's still uncertain, which is the outcome of an actual bout. And then the narrative will shift depending on who wins the bout, which is, they may be scripting it in the background, but for the audience, it's unknown. But that got me thinking of, this is actually a historically weird and novel element in the evolution of narrative. Like, traditionally, storytelling was never about like information. Like, people already knew all the stories they were going to hear, like traditional Christmas stories, right? You already know them. You just hear them over and over again. You might even watch, a Christmas story or movies like that repeatedly. So traditional narrative produces no information. More modern narrative, we expect it to produce information, and the way you do that is to create suspense. And in traditional narrative, you have things like, foreshadowing. You have principles like Chekhov's gun. If there's a gun in Act 1, it has to go off by Act 3, and that's the source of suspense. You don't know when it's going to go off, and who's going to kill. So now I'm starting to think, so there are all these tropes and stuff which everybody's rehearsed in, everybody's literate in, everybody knows how to parse and produce. So that's the known, certain, hard element of narrative. So I'm now asking you guys a reverse question. What's the unknown in decentralized narrative? What keeps the surprise going? What's the equivalent of the outcome of a wrestling bout? So what's the atomic level source of surprise in decentralized narratives?
I think one part that feels the most exciting to me, especially in like multiplayer games or experiences, is like you might know the tropes and what moves are available and what possible outcomes there are, but you might not know what role you're playing within something. So like if you're in a game world, you might not know like what way the game is going to go and what the outcome will be for you and what persona you will have to move forward with as a result of that.
So the persona that someone would adopt is a kind of navigation aid, or part of the navigation of the world is to discover the way in which they're going to navigate the world, if that makes any sense. Like, it's like the step one, find out how you make moves, basically. And which means that I guess there's in a certain sense we're back to like you have to have an interaction with the narratives or with the world in order to be able to do that. Because we were discussing, one of the principles of fan fiction is it's written by fans, right? But yeah, like we're in an environment where we're all talking about systems telling stories as well. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but.
There's a thought in what you just said about like finding out who you are. That line reminded me of the movie Unbreakable. Did you guys watch that? Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson. And it's an old movie, so if you haven't seen it, I'm going to spoil it for you right now. But in the end, Samuel L. Jackson says something to Bruce, like it's like a gritty noir version of like a superhero fable. But in the end, he tells Bruce Willis something like, "Now that you know who you are, I know who I am." So that's because you're the superhero, therefore I'm obviously the supervillain. We have opposed traits and so forth. And maybe to build on what you just said, what massively decentralized multiplayer narratives do is a process of mutual definition, and that's kind of like what emerges. And some of it is tropes, like maybe I know I'm entering the game in like the top right of the Bartle test and I'm an explorer or something, but that's not enough. It's like a very generic commodity category I'm in. I need to know, like, am I a Frodo Baggins type explorer, or am I like, I don't know, Shackleton going to the South Pole? Maybe it's that we help define each other through the narrative, and maybe that's what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I think like at Moving Castle, when we make the game, we have this concept of the narrative engine, which is like, it's kind of like the notebook in Death Note. I don't know. It's like it's something in the world that once one or like a faction of players interact with is going to cause a consequence for the other players to react to. And so narrative, it doesn't only becomes this act of constant creation, but it's also always this reaction Or like Blazeball, I think is also a good example of how it's a reactive process between the developers and the audience. So there's, it's like I think like I would define like loot as a narrative device, and like the narrative device kind of like push you individual to build a story on top of like this prompt, but it doesn't create like a web of connection between all the people telling the story somehow. I don't know. But, yeah.
I mean, this is the thing though, like we've been discussing this, but actually the more that you talk about this, you end up just having more and more questions rather than, offering answers. And maybe this is something that if people want to talk about narratives tomorrow in the post-assembly, perhaps we could at least maybe arrive at some sort of question that we want to pose tomorrow. We didn't put one in the slides. But yeah, I mean, this was my prompt that I was thinking that what is narrative and what do we mean if it's decentralized? And the we being kind of quite like an important part of that.
I kind of remember mine. We all wrote our questions down before the panel, so I might be misremembering part of it, but this has also raised a lot of good new questions. I would pose the question of like, how might you expand the frame of what you're thinking of as a game right now? So if you have a game in mind, how could you theoretically think about the things that it might exist on top of that? So the fan wikis or the YouTubers, things like that. But another question that's coming up for me right now is like, how much of other players' experiences are you experiencing by default as a part of the game? So like something that seems to be like a differentiator across a lot of the things we're talking about is like, if something is consumed individually, what level of work are people putting in to have others consume their experience of that? Like for some people, they would have to create content about it. For others in a game, they're automatically in a shared world and cast in different roles and negotiating boundaries in a co-evolving way. And so it's kind of just like a way to think about like how multiplayer is something really, or in what different ways could something become multiplayer, even if it's not by nature?
Good question. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Yeah.